Hi there. I now want to look at how we transform columns and rows using a Power Query inside of our Power BI. The first thing I want to look at is working with the top rows button, and I'm going to start by choosing the Bike Products by Month query. This is a CSV file that we imported into our Power BI. And when I look at it, I can clearly see that it's a bit of a mess. We've got a heading up here, we've got a blank row, we've got a heading called months, then we've got some actual month headings, another blank row, a couple of headings here, and then we get into the data. So the first thing I want to look at as far as transforming this particular query is working with the top rows. Now, also just looking over here at the query steps, I can see the source of this file just by clicking on the first option here, and it's giving me the source up here, and I can see that it's changed the data type of some of the column headings. Not a lot's going on. Okay, first thing I want to do is look at the remove rows button. If we click this option, we have the option to remove so many top rows or so many bottom rows from the selected query, or we can remove alternate rows. We could remove duplicates, just keeping the first one of each group, and we could remove blank rows, and we could remove errors. Now what I want to do is start by removing some of these top rows. So I go into top rows. And a wee window will come up and say, well, how many of the top rows do you want to get rid of? So let's say I say 2, and I go, okay. A new step is now generated in my applied steps, and the 2 top rows have been removed. But then once I look at the data, I'm like, oh, I should have said 3. I don't have to repeat and do another step, and that is to remove another top row. What I can do is go to my applied steps and use this cog here to get into the settings for that particular step and change it. So if I click the cog, the window that came up originally where I put 2 in, I'll change that to 3. So this is not an additional 3 rows. This is just saying, actually, I meant to delete the top 3 rows, and I'll click OK. And so now the top 3 rows are gone without creating an additional step. If I decided, actually, I don't want to remove the top rows, then this little X here allows me to remove the step, which is effectively undoing that action. So if I delete that, then I'm back to having those top rows. So you can delete steps. You can get into their settings. There's a little cog here, for example. So that little cog is telling me about the source data, that it's a comma separated value. It's located in this path and it's called this. It's a CSV file, and so on and so forth, and the delimiter was comma. So I'll go cancel. So the cog is when you want to get into the details about a step, and the X is when you want to delete a step. So let's repeat adding that third step. I want to remove rows, I want to remove top rows, I want to remove, oh, now this is because I'm sitting here. Because I'm sitting on source, it's saying, do you want to insert this step above source where really it should have been the third and last step? So of course I don't want to insert it before I bring in the data, so I'll cancel that. I'll click on change type, and now it will insert that step underneath change type. So remove rows, remove top rows, remove the top 3 rows, and OK. And it becomes the third step and has removed the top 3 rows. So that's a very handy button to remove top rows, bottom rows, rows that have got errors, duplicate rows, alternative rows, things like that. And we've also now looked at how you can start managing those steps on the right hand side. So what this basically means is that Power Query will establish a connection to that file. It will change the type of some of the columns, and it will remove the top rows, just instinctively, automatically. Those are the steps that will apply to that data. Now, let's also have a look at promoting headers. This first row contains headers like January, February, March, April, May, and yet my columns are called column 1, column 2, column 3. I want to lift this first row up and make it become the column headings. So we're going to use a button that promotes the headers. And that button is basically, I'm just going to have a Yes, it is this query that I want to work with. So I'm just going to just promote this using this button here. This button here, use the first row as headers. If I click it, I'll get a fourth step, and that first row will be lifted up, and now these are considered headers. Notice that you can also, if I hit the drop down on this button, you can use the headers as a first row. So if the first row, if the headers have been interpreted as column headings and in fact they're actually data, if I click this option, it pushes them down to actually being a row rather than headers. So there's two options there. Make the first row a header or make the headers go back to being a first row. You can choose. And it's giving me both of these, so I actually don't want this last step, so I'm actually going to delete that last step just by hitting that X. And I'm also going to delete that step, and I'm back to here where it's promoted the headers. Now, I promoted the headers with this step here using this button here, and Power Query has gone and added another step. As a result of promoting those headers and moving these text entries up to the top, it's reassessed the data types of these columns. Originally, it had these columns as text columns A, B, C. But now, because we promoted the headers, it added automatically a fifth step that went through and examined the columns, the first 1,000 rows, and says, actually, this is a number, this is a number, this is a number, and these are still text columns. So sometimes Power Query will add in extra steps that make sense. Okay. So we've looked at removing rows, and we've looked at using the first row as a header. Now let's have a look at some of the things that you can do with columns. I want to look at how you select columns, and that is just simply by clicking on the column heading. But if I want to select two or more columns and they're in a range, I can click the first column, hold the Shift key, and click the last column, and that's a range of columns. But if I need to choose every second column, then I'll click the first column, hold the Control key, and click every second column. So those are methods that you have available to you to select columns. Another way to choose columns is using this button here. I can choose columns and simply tick, unselect all, tick the ones that I want to choose, and OK. And I will go and delete that step. It actually removed them. So choose columns, that will actually choose the columns that you want to keep, whereas go to column will actually go to, say, April, and OK. And so that's gone to the April column. So different ways that you can select columns, and we're going to work with columns very shortly. Okay, so let's now bring in another source. So in my Power Query, I'm going to go to New Source, I'm going to go to Excel Workbook, and in my collection of files, I'd like to bring in Target and Actual Sales. I'll click Open, the navigator will eventually appear, and I'll be able to choose Sales by Region. I can preview the data, and I can go OK, and it brings in that particular query. Now, because I was sitting in the flat files group, it automatically brought in the sales by region into the flat files group. If I drag it down to other queries, then it will sit in that group. But I actually do want it to sit inside of this particular group. So you can drag things up and down, not only to arrange them all alphabetically, but also to organize them into groups. So I've brought in sales by region. Now I can see here that the first row really should be treated as column headings. So I'm going to click this button here, use the first row as headers. And so that's added a step to promote my headers, and therefore it's reassessed the data types. Now I want to remove the grand total column. So I click on the column grand total, and I can remove columns just by using this button here. If I remove other columns, it'll remove all the columns except for grand total. So that's a great way of blitzing a whole lot of columns except for the ones you've got selected. But I'm just going to remove this column. You could also use the delete key, and that would also delete that column. Now I want to remove the last row. So I could click on it and press the delete key, or I could go remove rows, remove bottom row, and the bottom one row, and OK. I'd now like to rename the first column, so I can right click and I can rename that column, or I could just double click and rename it, or press F2 and rename it. I'd like to call this column region and press enter. So I've manipulated the data that I've brought in, sales by region, and these are all the steps that I've carried out. There's the source, then it's brought in the data, it's promoted the headers, it's changed the data type, it's promoted the headers again, and it's changed the data type again, it's removed the column, it's removed the bottom row, and it's renamed the column. Let's bring in another data source. Actually, no, let's manipulate another data source. Click on bike products by month. This here, I have used the first row as a header, but I need to remove the second row. So what I'm going to do here is remove actually the top two rows, because the first row, if I check going across, just contains the word null. So I actually want to remove the top two rows. Remove rows, remove top rows, remove top two, and OK. And so they're gone. Now what I want to do is remove the first column. So I'm going to click on the first column and press the delete key. And so the first column's gone. I now want to rename the first column products. So I press F2 and I type products. And I've renamed that first column. So I've transformed the rows and columns in my sales by region query and in my bike products by month query. Those are some of the things you can do. Come back for more videos on other things you can do to transform rows, columns, and data. I'm just going to save my Power BI file, apply the changes, and I'll see you soon.